Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia here and the Korea Chair, Vice Dean and Professor at Georgetown University. And we're very happy to be with you today for this conference on North Korean human rights at a new juncture, COVID, regional players, and South Korea-U.S. cooperation. We're particularly grateful to be hosting or co-hosting this conference with Stanford, the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, otherwise known as APARC, and my colleague, Professor Gi-Uk Shin, who will offer some welcoming comments in a moment. I just want to say before we start that we're really gratified to have a wonderful group of speakers here with us today, including Representative Chris Smith, Representative Frank Wolf, Ambassador Bob King, Ambassador Shinhwa Lee, and then the other very important people who are gathered with us here in the CSIS studio today. This is a very important time to be speaking about North Korean human rights. We know that North Korea often is in the news for other things, as it has been this week, with the ballistic missile firing over Japan and then more activity overnight. But that in no way should obscure the important issues of North Korean human rights. And I think, as we'll talk about today, these things should not be seen as disconnected. They're very much connected in many ways. So I look forward to a very good set of discussions. We have two panels for you here and for those who are watching us online. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce Professor Shin Gi-uk, who is Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center and the William J. Perry Fellow of Contemporary Korea at Stanford University, to offer some welcoming remarks and also to begin our first panel. So, Gi-uk, I invite you to the stage.
Okay, thank you, Victor, and also CSIS co-hosting this event with our center. It's my first trip to DC since pandemic began, and it's such a nice setup at CSIS. In our university, we are doing more seminars, virtually. So I feel like we are behind, Washington, even though we live in Silicon Valley. As Victor mentioned, over the years, our center has been doing a lot of projects on North Korea, ranging from inter-Korea relations to North Korean economy, and also a lot about nuclear issue. However, more lately, we have begun to do more work on the topics of North Korean human rights. This reflects a growing awareness that the human rights issue is foundational to dealing with North Korea. As you know, traditionally, policymakers have been hesitant to press North Korea on human rights because it was believed that doing so would only impede progress on nuclear issue. But actually, human rights are intertwined with the nuclear problem. After all, it is North Korea's human rights abuse that enabled the regime to focus resources on its nuclear program instead of its people. So making progress on the human rights problem, we believe, is key to making progress with North Korea on other issues, including security ones. So we are very fortunate to have Bob King here today to spend some time at our center right before pandemic began, and also followed by Victor Cha, who was teaching one quarter at Stanford. So we were discussing about having project on North Korean human rights. And then in the summer of 2020, we held a virtual conference to talk about this issue. Actually, I have So that project produced this book, North Korean Conundrum, Balancing Human Rights and Nuclear Security. And Bob and I were co-editors. And actually, a number of people in this room were authors, like Victor and Ned Gretchen and Min Jung Kim, and so on. So the book chapters look at a lot of UN's role, and then information flows into North Korea, human rights and denuclearization, and human rights in comparative perspective as well. So I think all of us were exploring the idea that the human rights issue should be integral part of policy toward North Korea, and they continue to minimize human rights in order to focus on security will not bring a resolution to the North Korean threat. Okay, this is even more apparent today that the nuclear threat has only become much more entrenched with Kim Jong-un's official announcement last month that North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons. I mean, we knew that, but he made it official publicly. So this announcement is just one reason why we now stand at a new juncture for North Korean human rights. Another reason is COVID-19, as we have to yet know how badly the North Korean people have faced during the country's extreme border closure throughout the pandemic. I'm sure we'll discuss that issue shortly. Also, the increasing friction between, on the one hand, US and South Korea, and on the other hand, China, comes to bear on the issue of North Korean human rights, complicating its resolution. So we have two panels today, and I will be moderating the first one, and then Victor will be moderating the second one. And then I hope that you'll enjoy our conversation today. So should I invite Congressman Smith and Mr. Wolf here in the chair? Yeah.
Do you want us to give an opening or no?
So what you said, I'll introduce you first. So we are very fortunate and honored to have two champions of human rights in the U.S. government and Congress. And each will be making some opening remarks, and then I will be moderating in a conversation with the two gentlemen. So first is Representative Chris Smith, who is a member of Congress representing New Jersey's 4th District. He's a co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Commission, Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which is, quote, charged with promoting, defending, and advocating for international human rights, unquote. And he is a ranking member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is tasked with monitoring human rights and the development of the rule of law in China. Our second panelist is Mr. Frank Wolf, who's a commissioner at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So he served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 34 years, representing the 10th District of Virginia. He's also a former co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So Mr. Wolf now serves as one of 9 commissioners on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which, quote, monitors the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad, unquote, and make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. So now let me first welcome Mr. Smith to the podium. So please welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so very, very much for that kind introduction, and especially want to thank CSIS and Stanford for co-hosting this very important event. Dr. Cha and Professor Shin are leaders and bring a tremendous amount of intellectual firepower to this effort to try to promote human rights and democracy in North and South Korea. So I want to thank them especially for that leadership. It does help us in policy-making positions to have such a wealth of information coming from these two tremendous leaders. In fact, Professor Shin's article in the Journal of Democracy called South Korea's Democratic Decay, which called out democratic backsliding in the administration of former President Moon, greatly informed the Lantos hearing that I chaired in April of 2021 that addressed deep concerns regarding civil and political rights and backsliding, as I said, in South Korea. So thank you for that article. It was very, very helpful, and it did help guide us during that hearing. Thankfully, the new South Korean administration seems to be taking human rights in both North and South more seriously, as evidenced by the appointment of Human Rights Ambassador for North Korea, Shing-Hwa Lee. Thank you for that leadership position that she now has assumed. And of course, it's pursuant to the terms of the North Korea Human Rights Act of 2016. And I would note parenthetically, President Moon failed to fill that position for all 5 years of his presidency. Ambassador and former U.S. Special Envoy to North Korea, Bob King, has done a tremendous job. You know, this is bipartisan. Bob used to be the staff director for the House Committee on Foreign Affairs under Tom Lantos, a good friend. Yes, we sometimes clashed on a few issues here and there, but always in a civil way. And when he served as ambassador, did a tremendous job. And he wrote a really good op-ed just a few days ago called "Insignificant Shift, President Yoon highlights North Korean human rights issues," and I commend it to everyone's reading. It was excellent, Bob. Thank you for that. And then it's an honor to join Congressman Frank Wolf on this panel. There is no greater champion on earth of religious freedom than Congressman Frank Wolf. As all of you know, among his many, many accomplishments in the House of Representatives, Frank is the author of the historic, comprehensive International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, the amazing law that, among other things, created the Religious Freedom Office at the U.S. Department of State, headed by an ambassador at large, and his law also created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which he now serves as a commissioner. I mean, that is really amazing that he's now serving in that position. So, Frank, thank you for that leadership. It's extraordinary. Today's conference, ladies and gentlemen, is an opportune occasion to remind ourselves of a particular fundamental principle of human rights, that those in North Korea who are persecuted by one of the worst repressive regimes on the face of the earth should be able to seek safety and freedom among the world's leading democracies. As we all know, it was mentioned a moment ago, notably and unfortunately, North Korea's COVID-19 restrictions have aggravated the country's already egregious human rights violations. A recent UN report, for example, cited extra restrictions on access to information, tighter border security, and heightened digital surveillance. Like other dictatorships, Kim Jong-un has exploited COVID to further tighten his iron grip to persecute, torture, and kill human rights defenders. Meanwhile, North Korea, as was also mentioned a moment ago, has continued its provocations. The New York Times wrote this week, over the course of the year, North Korea's missile provocations have become so frequent, 23 weapons tests since January, including 4 last week, and it then doubled down over this week by firing an intermediate-range ballistic missile over Japan, a chilling escalation. Against this backdrop, we need to remind the Biden administration of the compelling need to integrate human rights into all of its engagement with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. At one of 7 North Korean human rights hearings that I've chaired, Andrew Natsios, chair of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, told my panel in 2014 that the exclusive focus on denuclearization, decoupled from human rights, separated from human rights, was a, quote, abject failure. John Shifton of Human Rights Watch testified at my hearing last year and underscored the serious omission. He said, and I quote him, "Let me get straight to the point. Past U.S. policy and South Korean policy has not properly or adequately incorporated human rights protection and promotion into strategies to address North Korea, close quote. Frankly, I must emphasize that Beijing has continued to play a critical and a very negative role in sustaining North Korea's horrific human rights record. Xi Jinping must be called out, and to the extent possible, despite his own egregious record, held to account for what he is doing vis-a-vis North Korea. For example, China is complicit in the fate of thousands of North Koreans who try to flee across the 882-mile border between the two countries each year. China has also done little to crack down on the human traffickers who prey on North Koreans. Suzanne Schulte is here. Suzanne brought to our office several years back a number of women who had been trafficked when they made their way across the border. And in one case, and we actually had a hearing and they testified, one woman went across, a daughter, and she was immediately trafficked in China. Then the mother and the other daughter, in pursuit of trying to rescue her, went into China, and they were trafficked. So, Suzanne, thank you for that and all of your leadership. But it just underscored that rather than helping the People's Republic of China under Chinese Communist Party are part of the problem, and they look the other way and even enable the trafficking of these at-risk individuals. Then when they send them back, where do they go? They go to the Gulag. I have raised the issue with Gutierrez, our Secretary General, when he was with the UNHCR, and I got crickets. I said, why aren't you pointing out that this is a major, major violation of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol to which China has acceded? And again, there was nothing. There was no response. Everyone in this room knows that human rights are getting worse in China under Xi Jinping. Just look at what he's doing in Xinjiang. Look what he's doing, obviously, in Hong Kong. And the Sinitization of religion, which is making every single faith entity, from the Tibetan Buddhists to the Uyghurs to the Catholics to the underground, as well as above-ground Protestant churches and the Falun Gong, comport with Xi Jinping's socialist agenda. It is outrageous, and we all need to speak out much more about that. I have introduced the bill, and Frank and I fought very hard when many in our party and the other party during Bush and during Clinton wanted to de-link human rights from trade. We believed and fought very hard to say you've got to have them linked, and we will see an amelioration, at least to some extent, of the worst aspects of human rights abuse if it has a price for the Chinese dictatorship. And finally, I want to note that not only does the United States have a very, very special friendship and bond with the Republic of Korea, but also my home state of New Jersey does as well. New Jersey was among the states that deployed the highest number of troops, 191,000, to defend freedom in Korea, including my Uncle Frank, a Marine. And there is a memorial in Atlantic City honoring 5 New Jersey soldiers who were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their gallantry in action during the war. Our alliance is strong and enduring and forged in blood and sacrifice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Congressman Smith. Now let's turn to Mr. Wolf for your remarks. Yeah. So please welcome. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you, and I appreciate the generous introduction, and thank you all for taking the time, and thanks CSIS, which I've always had great respect for over the years, for having this event. I'd like to also thank the Stanford University Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center for co-hosting this event, and thank you for inviting me to speak on North Korea on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, where I serve as a commissioner. I also am glad to join the discussion with a longtime friend and colleague, Congressman Smith. I have said, and I mean this seriously, no one from the beginning of our Congress, from 1789 until this actually moment, has done more for human rights and religious freedom than Chris Smith. No one. Absolutely, positively no one. And he's still fighting and still has plenty of years left. I really almost cannot imagine a Congress where Chris Smith was not there. I've seen him stand up in our caucus and on the floor, taking on the most powerful And so I just thank God for him being there. For those of you who are unfamiliar with USERF, we are an independent, bipartisan U.S. government advisory body created more than 20 years ago by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 of IRFA. And I want to say that USERF has a great staff. Some of them are here today, but they really do an outstanding job of looking at all these issues all over the world. Our mandate is to monitor religious freedom worldwide using international standards and to make policy recommendations to the U.S. President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. USERF is separate from the U.S. State Department, but we work closely with the Office of International Religious Freedom, which was created by the very same legislation. Each year, USERF publishes an annual report describing religious freedom conditions in countries considered to be among the worst violators in the world. Under IRFA, the State Department is required to designate as a country particularly concerned, or as they call it a CPC designation, any country whose government engages in or tolerates systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom abuses. Unfortunately, there are more on that list probably now than almost any other time since the act passed. USERF has consistently recommended North Korea's designation as a CPC designation from 2001, including in our most recent 2022 annual report. The State Department has followed this recommendation since 2001 and reimposed ongoing sanctions on North Korea. So what is the situation for religious freedom in North Korea? While specific current information about conditions in North Korea is very difficult to obtain due to the country's isolated, closed nature, a monumental 2014 report by the UN Commission on Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea found that, quote, there is an almost complete denial of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Based on interviews with victims and witnesses and perpetrators, USERF released 2 reports on North Korea which clearly demonstrate that the government continues to treat religion as an existential threat and perpetrate horrific religious freedom violations against its own people. And I agree with what Mr. Smith said. Suzanne has brought many people used to come by my office, and the stories were almost unbelievable. You couldn't believe it was that bad, and yet in some respects it was actually gotten worse since then. The North Korean regime forces its citizens to unconditionally obey a state ideology called Kim Il-sung-ism and Kim Jong-il-ism. The idea of former North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are synonymous with the ruling ideology previously known as Juche. The state ideology forbids North Koreans to adopt and practice religion from birth, and is enforced across state and society, spanning every single aspect of the North Koreans' life. Whether a student in school, universities, an employee in the workplace, or a housewife at home, or all Koreans are required to adhere to this doctrine and undergo regular brainwashing lectures delivered by officials of the regime. Those who are found to be non-compliant face severe punishment. In addition, the North Korean government Sung-Sung-Boom system classifies citizens based on their perceived loyalty to the state. The government considers religious practitioners as belonging to the hostile class, and enemies of the state, and so persecutes them with extreme severity. North Korean Christians are especially vulnerable to persecution. If caught practicing their faith or owning a Bible, Christians could face harsh abuses such as long-term imprisonment, torture, forced labor, sexual violence, and summary execution. The level of extreme government repression has led the non-governmental organization Open Doors to consistently rank North Korea as the country where Christians face the most extreme persecution. Another NGO, Korea Future State, in its recent reports that North Korea's government persecution of Christians is systematic in nature and purposely directed at the destruction of Christian communities. Yet Pyongyang used to be almost considered a Jerusalem. People would talk about it in the past. In addition, the United States Kingdom All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea concluded in 2021 report that atrocities against Christians in North Korea could amount to genocide. Unfortunately, China, an infamous human rights violator of its own, as Mr. Smith laid out, for every denomination and every faith, plays a part in North Korea's persecution of religious believers. The Chinese government has long maintained a policy of repatriating North Korean refugees back to North Korea, totally disregarding the grave risk of persecution that they will go on when they return. Many of these North Korean refugees are assisted by South Korean Christian missionaries and NGO workers based in China who played an instrumental role in helping the North Koreans escape to South Korea. However, the Chinese government crackdown on deportation of South Korean missionaries since 2017 have had a significant impact on North Koreans who want to escape. Moreover, North Korean Christians and other escapees who have had contact with South Korean Christian missionaries in China face an even more severe punishment when repatriated back to North Korea. During COVID-19 pandemic, tightened security along the borders between China and North Korea, as well as being China and Southeast Asian countries, have made it even more difficult for those vulnerable North Korean refugees to escape from North Korea. According to the South Korean government, only 19, since the beginning of this year, only 19 North Korean refugees arrived in South Korea so far, and in 2009 it was roughly 3,000. Furthermore, China, along with Russia, has long served as North Korea's protector in the United Nations. As permanent members of the UN Security Council, China and Russia have used their veto powers to enable North Korea to evade international security scrutiny and sanctions, even over its human rights abuses and nuclear provocations. You would think that China would say, no, you can't do that. You would think that Russia would say, no, you can't do that. You would think the patriarch of Moscow would say to Putin, no, you can't do that. The North Korean government atrocities against Christians in particular, and persecution of religious practitioners more broadly demand an international response. However, nuclear security and security issues tend to dominate the bilateral and multilateral negotiations with North Korea, and they often overshadow human rights and religious freedom violations. That mistake, though, was not made during the 80s. The Helsinki Committee, Mr. Lantos used to go and push. When Mr. Lantos would be there in Russia and when Chris Smith would be there, they always raised human rights. They always raised religious freedom. And then they went on to the other issues. That was Lantos, it was the very first issue raised. If you're ever in a meeting with Mr. Smith, it's the very first issue, even though the delegation's purpose may have been for some other things. Security and human rights concerns need not be mutually exclusive. For this reason, USERF recommends that the U.S. government closely integrate security and human rights as complementary objectives in its policy toward North Korea. Relatedly, USERF also recommends and begs that the U.S. government fill the important position of the Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues at the State Department, as mandated by the North Korean Human Rights Act. This law was last authorized in 2017 and needs reauthorization again. This position facilitates the promotion and integration of human rights in U.S. policy toward North Korea, including coordination of multilateral efforts on the international arena. Since its inception, the Biden administration has publicly committed, to its credit, in making the protection of human rights a centerpiece of the U.S. foreign policy, and has promised to fill the position of the Special Envoy on North Korea rights, but it has remained vacant since 2017. We urge the administration and Congress to reauthorize the North Korea Human Rights Act and to fill the Special Envoy vacancy as soon as possible. Personnel is policy. You need that person. It needs to be there. That person needs to be there all the time, where that's their number one priority. Lastly, USERF also recommends that the U.S. government impose additional sanctions on North Korea for severe religious freedom violations, including coordinated multilateral sanctions with international partners, and only consider lifting certain sanctions in return for concrete progress on religious freedom and related human rights. USERF will always continue to urge the U.S. government to integrate religious freedom as an important part of its overall policy toward North Korea, and to work closely with other Western nations and our Asia partners in bilateral and multilateral negotiations. Now I'm going to end, but I have 4 thoughts that I just had. I wrote it at the breakfast table today. I'm not speaking. Everything here was speaking for USERF. This is speaking for Frank Wolf and thinking about this issue. And I appreciate the great staff at USERF sending me a lot of articles. I've read more articles on North Korea in the last 2 weeks than just about anything else. These are some personal thoughts. I don't think they're too controversial, but I believe that they can make a difference. One, I think two individuals who I personally believe could fill the role of a special envoy are Roberta Cohen, who has extensive experience, worked at the State Department, worked at Brookings, goes all the way back to the days of Muskie, and my good long-term friend, Carl Gershom. Carl just retired from the National Endowment for Democracy. He was there from '83. My committee funded it for years. And Carl, and if they were not prepared to do that, I think they would know who they could recommend, along with Bob King, on who should do that quickly. Secondly, I think the administration should arrange for some members of Congress who have been to North Korea. I went back and I Googled, who in the Congress today has been to North Korea? There are only two left. Speaker Pelosi, and I appreciate her strong support with regard to human rights and religious freedom and for China. And great, I appreciate her going to Taiwan, and the other is Joe Wilson. So my recommendation is that Joe Wilson join. Perhaps the speaker would go, but if she didn't, my longtime friend, a Democratic member, so the members wouldn't have to be concerned, Congressman Tony Hall. Tony Hall has been to North Korea 7 times. I called Tony the other night. I mean, he was my best friend. We were in a covenant prayer group together. And we still do things together. We traveled the world together, but we still do things together. I said, Tony, would you go? He said, Frank, I would go. And he said, and the North Korean officials know that I would speak about hunger and things like that he says, yes, I would go. So if you could have the speaker, if she would go, but Joe Wilson and Tony Hall and maybe Elliot Engel and Chris Smith to lead the delegation, it would make all the difference in the world because relationships would be established. I have seen before when congressional delegations would go sometimes, that would be the icebreaker that maybe the administration wouldn't want to kind of do it and say it, and they could deny it if the congressman says something, but they could then accept it. I believe Congress working with the administration, and I think Elliot Engel, I think, would also go, and there are 1 or 2 others that have served on the committee that the committee knows that I think would make a difference. Thirdly, I think the administration should ask Franklin Graham to go to North Korea. He's been there several times. The Graham family has a long history. Ruth Graham studied in the Capitol in North Korea for 3 years. I remember watching when Billy Graham went there in '92 and '94, and Franklin's been there four times, only to talk about hunger and famine and things like that. But I think to bring some people that have had a long history that the North Koreans have seen come, who have come in the spirit of Jesus, if you will, that we feed the hungry, we feed the poor, we do that, I think could kind of be an icebreaker. And lastly, I think the administration and those in the administration should meet with groups like Susan Schulte, and Susan used to send groups by my office with the North Korea Freedom Coalition. Nicholas Eberstadt from AEI, who's a very knowledgeable guy. Daniel Maxwell from the Foundation of Defense and Democracies, and Greg Sarlatu for the Committee on Human Rights. They talk and are down and they see and they hear and they touch and they come. I think these are again my recommendations, and I thank you for having this panel because hopefully this session will be the beginning to kind of kick something off at a time. And when you think in terms of the people in North Korea, I think we owe it to them to do something, and I think this could be the beginning of doing something. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for wonderful remarks. I think setting up really nicely for our conversation. So this is how you're going to proceed for the first panel. So I'm going to lead a conversation with 2 gentlemen. We have a lot of great questions and issues to address. And then I open to the floor for questions. So I will take some questions from the floor here. And if you're joining virtually, I believe there is a section in which you can submit your question. So please submit your question, then we'll collect some of them to ask. Okay, let's start by going back to 1994, almost 30 years ago, when Clinton administration renewed China's most favored nation status, delinking human rights from trade. And at the time, actually, I watched this again before coming here. Then you should watch if you haven't done yet. So Mr. Smith made passionate speech of protest against delinking human rights from trade. So in retrospect, so would we have a very different situation today with China's human rights violation if the administration listened to your advice at the time? And relatedly, looks like we are having the same issue when it comes to North Korea by delinking human rights from nuclear program. So are we making the same mistake?
I think we run the risk of making the same mistake. We did it with Iran during the negotiations for the nuclear deal there, and both Frank Wolf and I chaired hearings for clergymen and others who were arrested by the Iranian regime, and there was no mention of it. There was no inclusion of any of that with the leaders of Iran. And frankly, the point you make about the delinking of human rights, I do believe when President Clinton linked human rights with trade, I did press conferences. I'm a Republican, he was a Democrat, and Frank, all of us did floor statements and said how grateful we were that our economic relationship with China was linked to fundamental human rights across the board. The president's executive order talked about serious and sustained progress. It included just about everything. It was so well done. And frankly, as the months went on, because we think we had the votes to take away most favored nation status, and it was bipartisan, from China because of Tiananmen Square and all of the terrible aftermath. So every month I would do a press conference looking at, in every category, how well or poorly China was doing, and they weren't doing well. So then I put together a letter. I went to Beijing. It was signed by 100 people, including my good friend Frank Wolf and Nancy Pelosi. Presented to the Foreign Ministry, about number 3 down the line. I didn't get a very high up person, but it was heard. All saying, we stand with Bill Clinton, that linkage to human rights is U.S. policy. We want profits. We're a capitalist country, but not at the expense of torture, forced abortion, and all of the other horrific religious persecution, which was absolutely pervasive throughout all of China. I heard while I was there, I heard it for the next couple months after that, that the deal is in. I was told that by the Foreign Ministry. I went to Warren Christopher and said, please, Mr. Secretary of State, they think we're bluffing. And we can't bluff, not on human rights, not when the lives of so many people are at risk. Sure enough, on May 26, 1994, the president, on a Friday afternoon where most members of the House and Senate had already gone home, delinked, at the end of the news cycle, delinked human rights from trade, and China looked us in the eyes and said, this is just an afterthought, it's a talking point, they're not sincere about it. And we have had a very hard time ever since convincing the Chinese that we are serious about human rights when it comes to the exploitation of their own people. And so I think we lost an opportunity. I think we'd have a different China now. I don't know how well democratically they would have advanced, but there's been so many times over the years where at a point of pivot, we've blinked. We did it with the Olympics, the most recent Olympics. As Xi Jinping was trying to get the Olympics games, at that very time, and several of us did write to the IOC and said, don't accept it. You know, we know what they did in 2008 with the Olympics. They rounded up all of the key players, the dissidents and the like, journalists, threw them into prison, kept them away from others who came in. We don't want a reprise of that, which we'll get. And sure enough, as he was planning for the genocide in 2014, he began that. That's when they were making their appeal to the IOC. Simultaneous with that, he was beginning a genocide where he said, "Show no mercy." So again, the international community, and I include us in that, did not do what we could have done to stand with the oppressed rather than with the oppressor. Lastly, one of the things that Bill Clinton, and I'm not being partisan here because there's been blame on all sides, hindsight is often 20/20, but of all people to invite to the White House, President Clinton invited Cho Ha-tien, the operational commander of the Tiananmen Square massacre. He was now the equivalent of our Secretary of Defense. Gave him a 19-gun salute right down the road here at the White House. And this man said, nobody died at Tiananmen Square. Now, I read the People's Daily in English all the time. They were playing this up big time back home. Big lie, a blatant lie. So I put together a hearing in 2 days. We invited him or anybody from the Chinese embassy to dispel that unbelievable myth that he was getting away with when he said nobody died at Tiananmen Square. Meanwhile, he was feted he should have been, frankly, in my opinion, brought to The Hague for crimes against humanity for what he was operationally commander of, and that is the terrible bloodletting and repression that occurred at Tiananmen Square. So at different inflection points, we have been weaker than we should have been. It doesn't take that much to link the trade. I often argue with the Chamber of Commerce and others during those years. We worry about loss of intellectual property rights and copyright infringement. Well, if they're doing it right on the human rights side, you're more likely to get at least some adherence to the intellectual property protections that now our corporations have realized they've gotten ripped off left, right, and from the middle. And so I have a bill in now that would reimpose the MFN linkage for serious and sustained progress. It won't get a vote this year. I'm going to try very hard to get it next year. But we've got to say we stand for something, and the same goes with North Korea. I mentioned Andrew Natsios. Andrew Natsios was a top leader with USAID, a very, very seasoned diplomat when he was working as, with the human rights for Korea. He couldn't have been more emphatic at that hearing and in conversations before and after about how important it is to have at the table, not on some sidebar when you're having a cup of coffee with the diplomats, center stage, because human rights, it also means that the treaty is more likely or executive agreement to be adhered to if they're getting it right on human rights. We don't expect accomplishment and nirvana overnight. We do expect progress. And for the people of China, for the people of North Korea, we're looking for real progress because it's bad, it's horrible, and it could even get worse from this.
Okay, thank you. Then let me ask a question to both of you. Still, we don't know for sure how badly the COVID-19 affected North Korean people, but there's speculation that maybe the risk of starvation due to COVID-19 has increased, and therefore UN has been calling for easing some sanctions against North Korea. But at the same time, North Korea is continuing its provocation. I mean, they keep shooting missiles. I think a few days ago, they toward Japan. So how should we approach this dilemma in dealing with North Korea? How should administration address this dilemma? So both of you?
Well, I want to just say I completely agree with what Mr. Smith said. I wrote a book, and in the middle of the book is a picture of me standing on the House floor applauding President Clinton, applauding, and all of my colleagues, all Republicans, are looking at me like, what is this guy doing? It's like they think I'm strange. And I appeared strange that night because I was so grateful for what President Clinton said during the State of the Union. And so I think what Chris said is exactly right. I had so many members since then say, Mr. Wolf, I think you were right, Frank, but it's gone. And we see now taking every faith group in there. So with regard to North Korea, I think my constitution and motto has been my faith. And I remember President Reagan said that the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence were a covenant, not only with the people in Philadelphia, my hometown, in 1776 and 1787, but a covenant with the entire world. The words in the Declaration of Independence are a covenant with the people in North Korea. We can't walk away from it. So I think COVID, I would help them on COVID. I would definitely help them. I wouldn't turn anybody down on COVID. I wouldn't turn but I would also insist and pressure and push with regard to human rights and religious freedom too. And I think they're probably going through, I think their economy is almost in the basket. They're having a very, very difficult time. I wouldn't say we're only going to give you this if you do X, Y, Z. COVID, you help anybody. I would help my enemy on that. But you push and you push and you push and you speak out. And I think you get that special envoy. You have people like Bob King and others speaking out. Everybody speaking out, and I think you can kind of break the back, whereby they will finally come around and do it. But I wouldn't condition it, but I should give it to them. I would pressure it, and I would continue. They always should speak out for human rights and religious freedom in whatever country it is and whatever our policy is. That has to be an important part of whatever else we do.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you for that question, and I agree with everything Frank said. And I would just add, you know, Piero Tazzi is our general counsel for the Lantos Commission, and we worked on a bill in 2014 called the Global Food Security Act. Matter of fact, he wrote it. It passed the House. It is law. We just reauthorized it a week ago. And, you know, we have a global crisis of food insecurity where 824 million people, according to the World Food Program, and FAO are at risk of starvation. They go to bed hungry, and nowhere is that more serious than in North Korea. We don't always get the data to know exactly what the parameters are, but we know stunting is a huge problem in North Korea. And Joan, who is also working on our staff, doing a magnificent job. Thank you for that. We are trying as best we can, I think, to figure out how do we get food and medicines to people who are starving. In the past, the military has co-opted some of that, if not much of it, and that's made for a difficulty when WFP was getting food in during a famine in North Korea. But I think given what's happening globally as well as North Korea-wise, we've got to care for the people who are suffering to the greatest extent possible. The only reason Tony Hall, who was former chairman of the Hunger Committee in the House of Representatives, has gone in and out of Pyongyang the way he has, because he cares about people who are starving and who are not getting, sufficient nutrition. I'm a big proponent of the first 1,000 days of life, from conception to the second birthday. If the mother gets the nutrition and the right kind of supplementation, not only are diseases mitigated that she might have or the baby might have, you just get stronger and frankly, stunting goes away. There's nothing like that going on in North Korea, and they need it. I remember years ago seeing a picture that said it all. It was the two soccer teams, South Korea and North Korea. And you could just see the stunting on the part of the North Koreans, that they just didn't get the food when they needed it the most during the first 1,000 days, and then right up into the 5th birthday, which is so all important. So we got to find a mechanism, a way. The UN certainly provides a potential mechanism there to make sure, particularly since COVID and now the worsening problem of what's happening with the crisis in food because of Ukraine, to make sure that people get the food that they need. And I do hope we can find a way forward on that, and so that the money or the food is not diverted to the military, that it gets to the people most in need. So that's a challenge that we have to face up to and hopefully accomplish.
Okay, thank you. Let me go back to China and inviting response from both of you. Some people believe that Chinese government also participate in human rights abuse of North Koreans, especially by repatriating North Korean refugees. But when we hear about China's human rights abuse, we tend to think about Xinjiang, Tibet abuse against Chinese citizens. So what work has the Congressional Executive Commission on China done on this issue of North Korean people being sent back to North Korea? And then what's your view, Mr. Frank, on this question?
Sure. Obviously, refoulement is a major violation of international law. As signatories to the as I mentioned earlier when I was speaking, to the Refugee Convention, as they are, China is bound by international law, and I do think the UN needs to speak up more boldly about what they do when they send people back to North Korea, where they're, the next step is going to the Gulag. I think the more open door policy needs to be shown, and I think it is with the new leadership in Seoul. We were all shocked and dismayed when those two fishermen in 2019 were sent back by the Moon administration. I was shocked by it. There needs to be a more welcome mat there, an open door to those who are fleeing and have a well-founded fear of persecution and are true asylum seekers. So I've held hearings on it. Others have done it as well. The administration, I think, needs to step up much more aggressively. I'm talking about our administration in the United States. We write the laws. And again, Frank, when he spoke, you probably missed this, but maybe you didn't. He talked about the International Religious Freedom Act. This man wrote it. He had the vision, and it was not supported by the administration. I held some of the hearings on it, and they were saying it would set up a hierarchy of human rights, which was a nonsensical issue. Frank overcame every bit of that and got it passed. So Frank, your humility is just amazing. But he's the guy that wrote it. Now he's actually on the commission for part of that legacy that he wrote. But I do think we need to do more to call out. I mean, I've raised the issue myself with the Chinese. You get nowhere. Again, I think the High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, they need to focus on this much more assertively. And same goes for the Council, the Human Rights Council. When you send somebody back to a certain persecution, that's against international law, and you signed it, China. Now live up to it, but they're not.
Well, I agree with Mr. Smith. I'm thinking of saying something, and I may say it, and I think I'm going to end with it. When I didn't know about the two fishermen being sent back until I read Mr. King's piece, I was going to quote it, and then I saw him here, but I didn't know about that. Did that even make the Washington Post? I don't think it did. So I didn't know about that, and so you always have to speak out. You always speak out. That's why I admire Jimmy Carter so much. He always spoke out. I think part of the problem was, and I think your name was quoted in it today, I just saw a group of bankers, I think you criticized, I think your name's in, bankers going to Hong Kong and having a big conference. Cardinal Zen, a 90-year-old Catholic cardinal who I've adopted as a prisoner of conscience, when they go to Hong Kong, are they going to speak out about Cardinal Zen? Are they going to speak about Joshua Wong, the young fellow that used to come by? And are they going to speak about Martin Lee? Are they going to speak? And I think one of the problems is there's been too much of a marriage. And I will say this, and I debate it whether I will, and I'm going to say it because if I die, I'll regret that I didn't. Read Josh Rogan's column in yesterday's Washington Post. There's actually, I didn't know it, there's actually a law firm in the city that represents the Chinese government. And so no one during the days of Jimmy Carter or during the days of Ronald Reagan, no law firm in this city would have ever represented the Soviet Union. They just wouldn't have done it. Jimmy Carter would have just gone after them, and Ronald Reagan would. So I completely agree. I think we need to, and I think the other governments respect us when we advocate for human rights and religious freedom. So I think it has to go back to like Tom Lantos did. Every meeting, have you ever been on any of the delegates? Every meeting that he went into, every meeting he always raised human rights and religious freedom over and over and over. That's why I admire the speaker actually going to Taiwan when this situation, she sent a message to the people. So Mr. Smith is right, and I think that we always have to speak out on behalf of those who are being persecuted for their faith or for no faith at all. But I think not to do that is really a negative with regard to our country.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question to each gentleman, then I'll open to the floor. So first, Mr. Wolf, I think there is a report that Pope Francis is interested in visiting North Korea if invited. So two-part questions. Number one, do you think his visit is feasible? And number two, if so, what impact, if any, might such a visit have on the state of religious freedom in North Korea?
Well, I think it is feasible. I doubt that they would turn the Pope down. Well, I did see that President Xi refused to meet with the Pope a couple weeks ago. I couldn't believe it. I would have hoped that the Patriarch in Moscow would have spoken out and said, "You must meet with the Pope." The Pope has tremendous moral authority. So I think to have the Pope visit North Korea would be instrumental both for North Korea. Maybe the average North Korean wouldn't see it. When Billy Graham went there, maybe they didn't all see it. But the ruling class would, you call it whatever you want, they would see it. And so for the Pope to go there, I think would be very powerful. It would also have an impact on South Korea. And it would also have an impact on here because we would see that the Pope took the time to go, 85 years old, to go there, and we would almost feel a moral obligation. So I hope and pray that the Pope will go. I think it will be good for this issue. It'll be good for everybody, and I hope he goes. And I think if he does ask, I think he'll be permitted to go.
Okay, thank you. So last question to Mr. Smith. We all know that cooperation between U.S. and ROK is very important in dealing with North Korea, including human rights. And the new government is really trying to strengthen the alliance between U.S. and ROK, and they appointed Professor Lee as a new ambassador to address international cooperation on those human rights. As you may know, there's a controversy in South Korea right now over Inflation Reduction Act, because that excludes Korean cars like Hyundai, for example, from getting benefits and rebate, right? Because it was produced in Korea. So right now in Korea, some people very disappointed, even some are betrayed, because as you know, many Korean companies, Samsung, SK, Hyundai, they made or promised a huge investment in the United States. But then now, all of a sudden, they hear news that they are out of this act. So do you think it's fair to Koreans? Would it affect future collaboration between two allies in addressing North Korean issue and other pressing issue, including China and others? So what's your thoughts?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act was rushed through Congress. I voted no. There were no hearings. There were no, we added 87,000 new IRS agents in that bill. Where's the justification? Who pointed out in any way, shape, or form that there was a need for that kind of doubling of the number of IRS agents in the United States? There are a lot of other parts of that bill that got no scrutiny or very little scrutiny, and I think that's the worst way to write legislation. I mean, when Frank Wolf did his International Religious Freedom Act, when I wrote the laws on human trafficking, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we held hearing after hearing after hearing after hearing to get it right, to hear from stakeholders, to figure out what the consequences are, pro and con. Great believer that you got to go that route. This thing was rushed through. Now, the idea that a tax credit for electric vehicles, EVs, only goes to North American businesses like Canada and the United States, I think is discriminatory against the South Koreans and others. I mean, I know that Hyundai wants to put a plant in Georgia, and it's a huge investment. What's it, $5 billion, $5.5 billion? I don't know the exact amount, but it's something order of magnitude. And to say that you're not going to, if you buy a car that's made by Hyundai, you don't get the tax credit, and it's a significant tax credit. No matter where you come down about the efficacy and the advisability of completely transforming to electrical vehicles, at least make the playing field fair. And this is patently unfair by the administration and by the Congress in passing this through, again, without the kind of scrutiny that it deserved. Yeah, now people say now we got to change the law, and we may do that, but it was a shot right in the face, I think, into our friends in South Korea to do this and to say, yep, you can build your cars here, but you're not going to buy them. Because remember, if I'm an American consumer or someone who wants to buy an electrical vehicle, and if I buy an American-made one, or Canada, I get a $7,500 tax credit, where do you think I'm going to go? I'm not going to buy the Hyundai. And so I think it's discriminatory, it's unfair, and not, it needs to be reversed, which it may or may not be done. So
then, do you see any possibility of amendment, especially after
sure.
election?
And now people who now are feeling the political pressure will say, oh, now we got to go and reverse this and get it right the first time. This is one thing. I've been in Congress 42 years, and I get tired of people who vote for something only to find out the next day or the next week, oh, that was in there? We have to change how we do business. And again, a great believer that I am, and Bob remembers when he was Chief of Staff for the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, I held more hearings on different policies. I'm always learning. As a Congress, we need to be always learning. What are the consequences of this bill? And and I know the Canadians, because this was something that didn't just happen, they were aware of it. I got some phone calls from the Canadian Embassy about, why isn't Canada included? Well, they ended up getting included, but not our great friend and ally, South Korea. And I think that's not just oversight. There's something wrong here that needs to be fixed. Okay, maybe it gets fixed end of this year, into next year, but very poor lawmaking.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. Such a fascinating conversation. So let me open to the floor here. So if you have any question, please raise your hand and identify yourself, and then ask a question, not lecture, but a question. And then we'll pick a few from virtual audience. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Haejun from Radio Free Asia. My question is, I want to hear more thoughts on sanctions. So we're seeing headlines that North Korea is firing missiles, but at the same time, we're not seeing as much on the human rights issue. So do you think whether it's easing sanctions or not strengthening sanctions, whatever the strategy may be, do you think sanction could be a vital tool to bring human rights issue at the same burner, at the same level of the burner as the military side of the nuclear issue of North Korea?
I think I got the question. Yes, I think sanctions in the pursuit of adherence to fundamental human rights norms and treaty obligations are absolutely necessary. In Frank's law, there are at least 18 sanctions that are prescribed, and very seldom the executive branch does not use all of the means that is within their what they can do to go after a country that's CPC, country of particular concern. Same way with the trafficking, North Korea is a Tier 3 country, egregious violator of human trafficking, both labor, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And there are, again, a prescribed list of things that could be done. I just think we need to be much more assertive in saying, just like the nuclear issue, just like the provocations that we're seeing requires a response, an economic one, we also need to be doing it consistently with regards to human rights. Sanctioning. So, you get to the point, and Bob King probably could speak to this even further later, where, because of Juncture, and I remember reading a book about that years ago, and I learned, frankly, and had a hearing about it, about how important it is to realize that they deify the Kims. Mm-hmm. That's not well known in America, that there's this sense of deification, and he is not God. By any stretch of the imagination. He's just another person that's at the head of a country, and a dictator at that. So I do think we need to use more sanctions and be very upfront about it. When you ever hear North Korea even mentioned by the administration, I would hope that they would do it more.
Mr. Frank, anything to add?
I agree with Mrs. Smith. I think sanctions are very, very important. And at the very time you're putting on the sanctions, that you speak out boldly and strongly over and over. And sometimes you got to say it 10 times, but over and over and over. But I do agree with Mr. Smith.
And I would just add, and also to work to get other countries to join in unison with us. I mean, in the early 80s, I was very much in favor of sanctions against South Africa because of apartheid. And one of the main reasons why that worked was that we had a unified world, and that led to the end of apartheid. Unfortunately, we often get a great deal of enthusiasm up front as something happens, and then over time there is almost like a compassion, human rights fatigue that sits in, and people don't want to keep the sanctions on the way they did before, and that's not good. And we saw with Iran where a lot of people broke holes and violated the sanctions, frankly, so you need to have good enforcement too when you have sanctions. Not allowing countries to use banks is one of the most effective sanctions that we have, so that it makes it harder for them to engage in world commerce. So getting our allies to join us on North Korea. You know, when you get to the UN, the Human Rights Council, everybody will say the right thing, but what are you willing to do about it?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go to the next question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Marty Flax. I run the Human Rights Program here at CSIS. And I wanted to come back to this decoupling of trade and human rights issue. You know, Congress has led the way in the last few years in recoupling those issues in a few areas, particularly in the area of imports, right? So Congress passed CATSA that cracks down on goods from North Korea made with forced labor, closing some loopholes in the Tariff Act, and then, of course, last year passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I'm curious your impressions of how the administration, two administrations now, have been implementing those laws, how effective that has been, and where you think Congress will go next in this area of sort of import controls or other kind of trade restrictions based on labor or other human rights issues. Thanks.
Well, personally, I don't think it's been very effective. I mean, if you read the column that I mentioned, I was at an event where there was a young man who was in a labor camp, Uyghur labor camp, and keep in mind, next to the Uyghur labor camps are crematoriums. And I also saw a conference whereby there are 60 to 75,000, mainly Uyghurs, but some Falun Gong, who have had their kidneys and organs and hearts taken out and sold. The camera, I listened to the gentleman, it just knocked me over. It was at the Earth Summit. He said in the camp were Hikvision cameras. Hikvision cameras? We allow Hikvision to import and sell here? I just can't. So I think, I mean, and you have Hikvision represented by a Republican, former member, Republican in Congress, and a former Democratic member. So I think the sanctions have been relatively weak. I'm not so sure that really the administration has been nearly as strong on the sanctions with regard to what's taking place in that province, because you hear all these different things going on and all the time. So I think the sanctions have been relatively weak, and I think there's not been enforcement from Congress, and I think there's not been the enforcement from the administration.
I would agree that there's been lackluster enforcement of sanctions. I was the prime Republican sponsor of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and we know that entities are put on the entities list, and that's a good thing. The presumption that anything coming out of Xinjiang is presumed to be made in a gulag, and therefore it's not importable and could be stopped. That's all good, but it needs to be very aggressively promoted in terms of, CP, the Border Patrol and others put out great guidance, and I hope it's all being followed. It remains to be seen, and let's err on the side that they're trying to do the right thing. But we also know that the green efforts, trying to get more, for instance, EVs, electric vehicles. I chaired a hearing just a few weeks ago about what is happening in the DR Congo, where China has taken over the mines for cobalt, and the average car needs between 13 to 26 pounds of cobalt to make it go. Some put the number a little higher, but that's one good estimate, I think. And how is that all being done? You have little kids in the DR Congo, and China is running all of this, all kinds of corruption on the part of the DR government, DR Congo government, to allow this to happen. So they're mining 35 to 40,000 children are in these mines, African children, getting sick, dying, no real occupational health and safety protections for them or for the adults. Americans who had those mines have sold them, and there weren't very many, so they're all in the hands of the Chinese. So they have a monopoly now on this emerging technology for EVs, electric vehicles, and ditto for what they're doing on solar panels and solar energy. We've raised the issue about the idea of some other countries having the ability to do the solar panels to evade our law, which Jim McGovern and I sponsored in the House of Representatives, which is signed. So it remains to be seen whether or not that's being evaded as well. I would hope that John Kerry, who is the czar for the Green New Deal, would do much more for climate change, would do much more in saying to his Chinese counterparts, stop the exploitation. How dare you do what you're doing in the DR Congo? I haven't heard a word. We're working on a bill right now that would try to mitigate the damage being done to those children by disrupting the supply chain, to make sure that, if you're going to have cobalt, make sure it's extracted in a way that does not kill people or injure them, particularly children and women. So there's always this, you get the signature on the law, and then, hold your breath, is it going to be implemented? And, other Republican and Democrat administrations have in the past, when it comes to human rights, been able to make it page 6 on their talking points. And that goes for trafficking, religious freedom, and everything else. So if we get control of the House, I will likely have the Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights Committee, and I hope, the China Commission. I will do more oversight hearings on these issues, and I won't be the only one. We really got to make sure that we stand, again, like I said earlier today, with the oppressed, not the oppressor. So it remains to be seen whether or not they're being implemented with any kind of real diligence.
Yeah, read Ecclesiastes 4:1. I looked, I saw all the oppression under the sun, and they have no comforter. Read Ecclesiastes 4:1. That's really what Christmas is talking about. And lastly, as he was talking, the words, I like Simon and Garfunkel. Maybe you all are too young, don't know. Simon and Garfunkel, the boxer. Man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. We are not hearing about it. We just want to, it's trade. So the boxer, man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Mr. Smith is right, and every member in the Congress know that they're right.
I would just add one other thing. During the battles that we had on most favored nation status, and then when China ascended into the WTO, which I opposed and had hearings on that as well, Frank Wolf and I, and Nancy Pelosi, and David Bonnier, a liberal Democrat from Michigan, we opposed MFN without human rights linkage, and we lost. Unfortunately, we did lose. I remember so many people saying at the time that, if you just trade more, they'll matriculate from dictatorship to a democracy. I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge if you believe that, and certainly that has not been the case with the Chinese Communist Party or any Communist Party anywhere in the world. Thank you.
Okay, this is a question from the audience. So I think to both of you, if you have a chance to meet with Kim Jong-un, okay, so what would you say to him?
Well, can I just say, Frank Wolf and I met with Li Peng in China, in Beijing, and we were merged with a trade mission of members of Congress, and they didn't know we were there just to talk about human rights, so I'm sure that staffer got fired. And what we did, and I'm sure Frank and I would do the same thing if we could meet with the leader, and that is raise the human rights issue civilly, assert the importance of having empathy for people who are suffering, telling them that we have no quarrel with the North Korean people. The only quarrel is with policies that subjugate them to persecution. And we did that. Frank Wolf actually had a list of prisoners of conscience, mostly religious freedom advocates, and put it into Li Peng's hand. He had the big chair, we had smaller chairs, and he wouldn't touch it. It was as if it was electrified or something. He looked at it like this. And the next day, we were told that some staffers somehow got in to see him as well, and he launched into a tirade about who were those two congressmen that raised all these human rights issues. But we would do it civilly and with respect in the hopes that it would help the suffering.
I agree with Mr. Smith completely, and I think what I would tell him if I met him, I would tell him, and I know some of you may not understand what I'm going to say now, I would tell him that I'm going to pray for him. I'm going to pray for him every night. I'm going to pray for God softens his heart, and he ends up changing, and that has happened. There have been a lot of leaders who have changed, and that's what I would tell them. I'm praying for you, but I'm praying that the Lord touches you and changes your heart.
Okay, I think we can take one final question, then we have to close. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Hyun-Young Park. I'm a Washington correspondent with 중앙일보. North Korea is doing extensive missile tests and escalating tension in Japan over Japan and South Korea. Do you think raising North Korean human rights issue can induce denuclearization of North Korea? How should human rights issues and its weapons program issue be integrated? That is my first question. I have another one. Biden administration positioned itself as defender of human rights and freedom, but when it comes to North Korea, we don't see much of it. One example, President Biden has not appointed North Korea Special Envoy for human rights issues. So what is taking so long? Thank you.
Well, last question first. He should do it immediately. Frank mentioned a few names that would do a tremendous job. I think Bob King would do a great job, but he did a wonderful job previously in that position. I don't know if he would want to do it because it took so much time and effort, but he is certainly ready and I'm sure very willing if he was asked. Sins of omission. When you don't do something like fill a very key position, it sends volumes, it sends a very clear message to Pyongyang about, how much we are focusing on human rights in North Korea. I mean, and in terms of the dialogue, I mentioned it earlier with Andrew Natsios and many other people saying this, and I've said it myself, the idea that you put in a separate channel, human rights when you're talking trade or anything else, is foolhardy. It means that human rights becomes a talking point that you get to, so when you appear before a congressional hearing, you can say, I raised human rights. Well, how serious was it? I remember when Hillary Clinton made her first trip as Secretary of State to China. There was an Associated Press article that I read, and I actually did a floor speech on it. She says she was not going to raise human rights, she was going to do other things like climate change. It needs to be part of every single conversation. Every congressman, congresswoman, every senator, every member of the diplomatic corps, and our folks in State Department, when they meet with, every time they turn around, the Chinese or the North Koreans or other totalitarian regimes need to hear that ever present. Don't have a human rights dialogue, which is a cul-de-sac that goes nowhere. It's a nice expression between the two. We've done that with Vietnam for years. We've done it with other countries, and there's no fruit to that. It has to be integrated, and I mean seriously integrated. That's why it ought to be integrated with all of our laws, including our trading law. And the more we do that, I think we will see, some of the people who are being tortured, and they're tortured in North Korea, they're tortured in China, for example, with impunity. And I had hearings about how they torture. And, you stay up at night thinking, how could any human being do that to another human being with cattle prods and all the other things that people do suffer? So my hope is that integrate human rights with trade, climate change, and everything else that's on the table with North Korea, with China, and every other repressive regime.
And during the Reagan administration, that was the first issue. There's even a story about it that the Russians would say, every time I meet with the Secretary of State, he raised it. And the Secretary of State said, well, every time I meet with Reagan, he raised it. Jimmy Carter raised it. Ronald Reagan raised it. I think it has to be raised at each and every meeting at the beginning. And in fairness, I watched Tom Lantos. He raised it. Do you think Tom Lantos would have gone to Hungary or Poland or Romania to talk about trade? Maybe it got trade in it, but always. The Helsinki Committee, always. Human rights and religious freedom, always.
Great, thank you so much. And then I recommend you read this book. There's some answer how to balance between human rights and security issue in dealing with North Korea. And it has been a great conversation, amazing remarks. And then hopefully we can continue our discussion on this pressing, important issue. And thank you so much joining here also, virtually. And then hopefully we can invite you to California. So we brought California weather today, and we'll enjoy again sometime soon. So thank you so much, and then we'll take a short break, then come to the next session. Thank you.
Okay, I want to first thank Professor Shin and Congressman Smith and Congressman Wolf for a fantastic panel, really excellent panel. And we're now following with the second panel, and on behalf of CSIS and Stanford, we're very happy to bring together, probably for the first time, the two special envoys, well, current and former special envoy. Even though he's former because we don't have one, I still consider him the special envoy for North Korean human rights. So let me get started first by properly introducing them, and then each of them, as the previous panel did, each of them will make some initial comments, and then we'll follow that by discussion. For those of us who are just joining us for the second panel, my name is Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair here at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. And like I said, we're very happy to have with us for her first visit to Washington, D.C. as the newly appointed Ambassador for International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights for the Republic of Korea government, Ambassador Shinhwa Lee. She is also serving in this role as ambassador, but also concurrently still retaining her position as professor of international relations and political science at Korea University. So she's actually teaching once a week, even as she's jetting across the world, twice a week, even as she's jetting across the world, building international cooperation on North Korean human rights abuses. She was also, or are you currently serving as UN Secretary General Advisory Group, member of the Peacebuilding Fund, and head of research, the Research Committee for the Seoul Forum of International Affairs. Previously, she was a special advisor to the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's Rwandan Independent Inquiry, the chair's advisor of the East Asian Vision Group, and she's held visiting teaching professorships at Columbia and a visiting scholar position at Stanford. She's also served as a member of the board of directors for the Academic Council for the United Nations System, a member of the, and among others, a member of the International Advisory Board for the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect in Australia. Many of you know Professor Shinhwa Lee's scholarship. She's written a lot on multilateral and comprehensive approaches to global security, on humanitarian issues, on UN peace operations, as well as foreign policy of East Asia and the East Asian security community. I should not neglect to say she is a graduate of Ewha Women's University, and she received her doctorate degree just up the road here at the University of Maryland College Park in international relations. Robert King, many of you know, is with us here at CSIS. He's a senior advisor, non-resident, CSIS in the Korea Chair. He served as Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues at the U.S. Department of State, nominated by President Barack Obama, confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and served in that position for the entirety of the 2 terms of the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017. He led U.S. efforts to press North Korea for progress on its human rights, U.S. humanitarian work in North Korea, and treatment of U.S. citizens being held in North Korea. Previously, as has been mentioned in the previous panel, he was staff director for the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Tom Lantos and Howard Berman, and prior to that was a senior professional staff member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was concurrently Chief of Staff for Representative Tom Lantos and had also served previously on the NSC staff during the Carter administration. He was also Director of Research and Senior Analyst at Radio Free Europe in Germany. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA in Political Science from Brigham Young University. So we are going to, we want to welcome them both here, of course, and we're going to follow the same format as the previous panel and give each of them an opportunity to provide some initial remarks, get some ideas out on the table, and then we'll have a discussion. So I think we'll ask Ambassador Lee first. You can use the podium up there.
Thank you, Victor, for kind introduction, and I also send my gratitude to Professor Shin and Chris Smith and all others to give me this opportunity. I've been served as this position as an ambassador of international cooperation on North Korean human rights issue for 2 months. But as I said, several colleagues here, I just feel like I've been already working for at least 2 years, because there are so many things was happening, mainly within Korea. But now I think about 10 days ago, I started to resume the overseas travel after 3 years silence of my travel due to COVID-19. And I just feel like I will catch up all my overseas overdue trip within 1 month or 2. Well, when it comes to North Korean human rights issue, I would like to tell you 3 points, which is by no means exhaustive, but I will just to give a try. And then another 3 points I would like to make in the limited time constraint for what I would like to do with you and all other international community. Well, when it comes to North Korean human rights issue, everybody appears to say something, but nobody knows exactly what is going on there, probably except the Kim Jong-un and the very few number of his top aide. Therefore, probably it's natural we have a lot of speculation and controversies, and then that is also lead to politicization of North Korean human rights issue. Although human rights issue, no matter which country we are talking about, that is about universal human rights or all about the humanity. Well, so my first point is still some speculation probably, but I will just give a try based on my 2 months old working hard gathering or information from different sources. According to the Freedom House, the Freedom Index, the North Korea is ranked the 0.3 out of the 100 point. Political right is 0 out of 40. Civil rights is 3 out of 60. Economic condition, mainly because of the sanction and COVID-19, they said is sluggish since particularly 2017. But still, I have to tell you that they said compared to the starvation in mid-1990s, they said food condition in North Korea is not as bad as before. So in that sense, the possibility of mass starvation is low, and the resumption of because of the resumption of market and the increase of amount of grain import from outside. So probably I can say then the North Korea's problem is not necessarily food availability itself, but maybe we can call what Amartya Sen once said, food entitlement. But I think if it's the problem of the food entitlement, that is something to do with the human rights abuse as well, because the access to food is very difficult for them. But still, we have to tell COVID-19 appears to be a very good excuse and opportunity for North Korean regime to consolidating their power. That is what we call regime security, which sacrificed the human security issues. And also they try to turning border area with China into kind of the DMZ-like isolation places. So it is very hard for North Korean just running away from their own country into China. So here, since I was saying some part of it, but still North Korea tried to tell, arguing that standards for each country of the human security are different. Human rights are different. So they do not recognize universal human rights, and they refuse to discuss it in international community as it is an interference in internal affairs. Currently, it is signatory to 5 of the UN International Human Rights Convention, but I think it is only a so-called selective implementation centered on children, women, and persons with disability. This is intended to dilute the image of human rights abuse by selecting areas that are easy to produce results and to block the international offensive. But violation of the right to freedom, fundamental rights are being violated in the name of eradicating so-called anti-socialism and quarantine. Public execution, arbitrary killing, detention, interception of information, to name a few, are the very typical example of their human rights abuse. Due to the discriminatory implementation of social rights, free distribution and medical service are only available to some elites, party officials, and Pyongyang residents. The Korean POW, I think only 80 returned POWs are available, are deployed in coal mines and etc., and 3 direct lineage are suffering. North Korea's forcibly repatriated are more likely to go to political prisoner camps, where they are subject to the torture and often, in the worst cases, arbitrary killing. In the COVID situation, human rights violations are becoming more serious, as I mentioned earlier, as they are over-controlling, such as blockades of the country and execution under the pretext of the quarantine. It is often the case that countries blocked without notice or movement is restricted without food security measures. The international community's assistance to North Korea also declined very sharply. Border closure and withdrawal of international organizations are a direct blow to those vulnerable groups of the North Korean people. For instance, the World Food Program Nutrition Food Factory was closed in March 2020, and the vaccine for infant and toddler provided by UNICEF was exhausted. And as you all know, by 2020 May, all European countries and other diplomats are forced to leave the country, and they are still waiting for coming back. Kim Jong-un used the term called irreversible, while declaring the legalization of nuclear force was a deception of the international community, which has been pursuing the complete, irreversible, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, that is the CBID. So while international community was working for decades to make a CBID, just Kim Jong-un just mockingly said or declared, it is irreversible to make their country the nuclear the status. I think that is so deplorable. Regarding North Korea's recent ballistic missile launch and declaration of legalization of nuclear force, it is more reasonable and realistic to induce North Korea to the negotiation table through international sanction and pressure on human rights issue. North Korea is seeking to negotiate directly with the United States always. It will take, at least in my opinion, 3 to 4 years to strengthen their national defense capability. Until then, there is high probability that North Korea will not come to the negotiation table because they want to do something with the United States about arms reduction rather than denuclearization. So it is very important to pressure North Korean regime through sanction and raising human rights issue. Second issue is China. China's complicity in North Korea's human rights abuse. I think because of the 3 reasons. Number one, they themselves have their own problem for breach of the multiple human rights norms, and it continuously neglect egregious human rights violations of North Korea. According to the Freedom House Index, I said in the case of North Korea, 3 out of 100 point rate, and then China was 9 out of the 100 point. It was way low. Despite international pressure, just like North Korea did, China said human rights is their internal affairs. In this sense, we can say China shares North Korea's vulnerability, which is human rights. Number 2 is China is mainly probably because of their increasing confrontation with the United States. They neglect or they obstruct any kinds of the UN resolution which try to address the North Korean human rights issue. Third, although, as Chris Smith has mentioned, although they are signatory countries to UNHCR, they are not that cooperative for those defectors who are still in China. And it is very hard for us to persuade China not to forcibly repatriate to the country they face the political persecution. The third issue is the human rights issue has been, as Andrew Yeo and Roberta Cohen has mentioned in their recent Brookings policy brief, human rights issue has been treated as an on-off switch. that is an extreme example of politicization. You recall that the President Trump was only highlighting human rights issue in 2017 General Assembly and 2018 State of the Union Address. But after 2018, the Pyeongchang Olympic began, and also summitory preparation has started. The term human right has flew away, and we couldn't find anything since then. Well, and then the President Biden, the pledge to during his candidate campaign, presidential campaign, he said that he will immediately appoint the Special Envoy of the United States. But it's been almost 1.5 years, or if not 2 years. But unfortunately, I don't see any specific policy of North Korea by President Biden. I had an opportunity to meet with a couple of senior officers in White House yesterday when I arrived in DC. They were very cooperative with me, and they emphasizing importance of the Korea-U.S. alliance to improve the human rights issue as well as the North Korea's military provocation. However, I got a feeling that they are not quite ready to appoint a special envoy due to a lot of administrative or other constraints. So that's what one of the State Department team leader has mentioned. Long and arduous process are still waiting for us, and there is no update to give us. So that is a pretty opposite, the information that I get from Ambassador Sung Kim when I met with him in mid-September, because he said that they might have a good news in several weeks. So obviously there is something going on, although I don't know exactly what it is. It was a kind of a disappointment to me since I couldn't find my partner yet. So having said that, I have since I almost used up my time, as a 2-month-old ambassador, I have 3 preliminary suggestions for you and the international community to work with. Number 1 is, why don't we define what North Korean human rights is about? We spent years and years to define what we mean by denuclearization, and we finally came up with terminology CBID. Unfortunately, it turned out to be not only failure, but also, as I mentioned earlier, Kim Jong-un said nuclear status is irreversible, quoting the term irreversible from CBID. So I think it's very important to define human rights situation and human rights language with like-minded partner is very important. I think for that, we have to approach from the perspective of universal human rights and also respect for humanity. And also, we have to define human rights situation and language for depoliticization and the bipartisan manner. For that, I would like to call for like a interdisciplinary and transnational and also governmental, non-governmental, and scholarly debate on a very consistent and systemic manner to come up together to think about what kind of consensus and definition we can make about what North Korean human rights is about. So no matter who became American or Korean president, no matter what kind of regime type came in, that principled consensus should not be touched by the politicized the evaluation. Secondly, I think we need to develop a new platform within or outside the United system for working on human rights issue. As we all know, as the U.S.-China's confrontation is increasing, and then the U.S. and Russia is virtually at war, it is very hard for us to making any kind of a consensus or any kind of agreement within UN Security Council. When I visited the European Union last week, they said I should approach to France. So I said, France? Not UK? And they said, oh, European countries not listening to the UK. So you only have one hope, that is France. But probably that hope is too weak. So, we have to think about, I still believe the value of UN, not only because I grew up with the United Nations, but also because UN is the only platform anyway we can get together. So I think for that, both based on our like-minded countries' very strong consolidation based on that. I think we have to persuade and we have to integrate unlike-minded countries into this framework. For that, I think we need a creative initiative and also kind of the ideas. Third, last but not least, I think we need to develop checklist on North Korean violations. While we can give a priority to accountability, I think it is also very important to seek ways to how we can make a so-called constructive engagement with North Korea that can include a humanitarian assistance. As I briefly mentioned about that in this morning's the CSIS Capital Cable interview, I don't mean my approach is similar to what the Korea's liberal government tried to do. When I say they try to emphasize humanitarian assistance when it comes to human security and human rights because they don't want to bother North Korea in consideration of the so-called special inter-Korean relations. But I don't follow their logic. What I was trying to say, humanitarian assistance is important is because that humanitarian assistance is very critical means to improve the human right of North Korea's ordinary people. So in that sense, I think while accountability should be given a priority, the humanitarian assistance as an important part of a constructive engagement with the North Korean regime should be considered very seriously. So that we have to develop the list with the civil society and think tank, because I got an opportunity to talk with several civil society NGO who's been who was dedicated to improving the North Korean human rights for 2 to 3 decades. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you for their commitment and then loyalty and also a tireless effort. So I think we experts or government should listen to those civil society to develop the list of the checklist of what we should do for North Korea human rights. And then also, as I mentioned already twice, both like-minded and unlike-minded countries has to do work together. So for instance, when I go back, I will closely work with the so-called Korea Peninsula Group. That is the group of the ambassador of the country that has the embassy both in South and North Korea. So I think that is very important. And then the last but not least, once again, public, private, academic cooperation is critical to make a consensus and then to achieve the noble cause for what we mean by North Korean human rights and also what we can do for North Korean human rights. Very final remark, since I'm in DC, I would like to, I just toured to the senior officer at the White House saying that I'm disappointed. I cannot see my partner counterpart, the Special Envoy with the United States. So while I strongly urge for the Biden administration to appoint the Special Envoy, but if it cannot happen right now, at least the President Biden has to announce for him military the connection the North Korean militarization and North Korean human rights abuse is the equally important and serious issue to his foreign policy agenda. By saying that, I do believe that can give a kind of the candlelight of hope for the North Korean people who are suffering now and within their country without any government's protection. And also, when it comes to Korea and U.S. alliance, I think full potential alliance will be achieved by not only we are talking about military and political alliance, but also we are talking about North Korean human rights on the same page. So thank you very much, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lee. Now, Ambassador King, give you opportunity to make some initial remarks.
Let me make a couple of comments. I think the most important part is getting on to your questions. The position of Special Envoy was created by the North Korea Human Rights Act of 2004. And the initial Special Envoy served for about 3 years. He was doing this part-time. He had another occupation. In 2008, shortly after the congressman I worked for, Tom Lantos, passed away, the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives extended the North Korea Human Rights Act of 2004 for another 4 years. In Congress, you don't ever leave anything on the books forever because you never know what might come back to bite you. So it had to be reauthorized. And so in 2008, we reauthorized the legislation. There was concern that the special envoy was not getting enough attention, that it was not being taken seriously enough. And so the decision was made that the special envoy position would have the rank of ambassador, require approval of the president, but also approval of the Senate, and this was to be a full-time position. The legislation said full-time position. In 2009, with the new administration, I was asked if I would accept that position. There was some concern about how long it would take to get me confirmed by the Senate, because the Senate wasn't moving quickly, but there was a senator who said he was going to hold up every other nomination if this nomination wasn't taken care of, and I was quickly confirmed. In the fall of 2009, I was sworn in as the special envoy with rank of ambassador. I served in that position for over 7 years. I resigned in January of 2017 as the administrations were changing. I'm unfortunately the last person to hold that position. We're now approaching 6 years since the United States has had a special envoy for North Korea human rights issues. One of the things that is interesting is the interplay between South Korea and the United States on the North Korea human rights issue. In 2016, the South Korean National Assembly adopted the North Korea Human Rights Act of 2016, which made a number of changes and created a number of institutions that were important in terms of South Korea. But it also created the position of ambassador for North Korea human rights issues. And there was an ambassador who was appointed, Lee Jung-hun, who served for a couple of years before a change in administrations, and then the position was left vacant for several years. With the new administration that was just elected a couple of months ago in South Korea, one of the welcome changes that was made was the appointment of Ambassador Lee as the ambassador for North Korea human rights issues. I think one can say that the United States has had a positive influence on North Korea in terms of creating the position initially, but I am hopeful that Ambassador Lee's appointment and her visit to Washington will have a reciprocal effect on encouraging the White House to make a decision that should have been made long ago to appoint the Special Envoy for North Korea human rights issues and have someone acting in that position soon. We'll see how effective this interaction between South Korea and the United States works out in that regard. I don't want to say a lot more because I know Victor has some tough questions, and I'm sure you have questions as well. And so I want to thank you for the opportunity of talking about this important issue, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you both for both very powerful statements to start us off. I guess since both of you raised it, maybe we should just discuss it a little bit more. I mean, the absence of the envoy. I think we should start off by first talking about. Maybe I'll go to you, Bob, first. Like, maybe you could explain to the audience out there, like, why this position is important from a policy-making perspective for the United States. I mean, we have an ambassador in the UN, right? We have an assistant secretary for democracy, human rights, and labor. But why, in particular, is it important to have an envoy specifically on this issue? Can you hear me? Okay.
it seems to me that as we look at North Korea, there are a lot of problems. The nuclear issue is an extremely serious issue. What North Korea, the role it plays on the Korean Peninsula is a destabilizing role. There are a lot of problems and a lot of issues that need to be looked at. The natural idea is that if there's a military issue, if there's a nuclear issue, if there's a problem like that, we have to give that first priority. And if we give that first priority, the North Koreans have shown remarkable lack of interest in dealing with that issue, it means that a lot of other issues with regard to North Korea are simply ignored. I think it's important to have a special envoy for North Korea human rights, because that means there's someone out there who's thinking about human rights and whose responsibility is human rights. And also, it's a position that's high enough in the hierarchy that the voice can be heard. We need somebody to talk about human rights. What do we need to do to make progress on human rights? As we look at trying to move North Korea towards some progress on the nuclear issue, it's important to have somebody saying, yeah, if we do it this way, we're going to have more progress with doing something on human rights. So simply having a voice, and with the rank of ambassador, it's a loud enough voice that it makes sure that human rights are a part of the process. So I think it's very important to have that voice part of the debate.
Thanks. And if I could ask Ambassador Lee two questions. The first is a similar question, which is, from the perspective of the Republic of Korea, why is it important for the United States to find your partner? I mean, from your perspective, why is it important to have a counterpart in the United States on this particular issue? When you do have Sung Kim, a special envoy for North Korea, we do have an ambassador in New York, we do have an assistant secretary. Why is this special envoy position important from your perspective? That's the first question. I'll give you the second one after you do that.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, although as you know, most of the time in foreign policy of Korea is devoted to the issue of the North Korea, particularly military aggression. Particularly since 2003, that we spent a lot of time on nuclear issues alone. But as you know, what is the nuclear like a test or nuclear weapon development? That requires a lot of money, which could have been used for welfare or survival of the North Korean people. So I believe, and it's not only me, but a lot of Koreans have some consensus that while we are talking about humanitarian assistance to North Korean ordinary people, if they just stopped just developing the nuclear or missile development, that resources could be used for like a development of the North Korean economy that also will benefit the North Korean people. But when we only focusing on the nuclear issue, it is very hard to somehow link to this issue alone. So that while we are just emphasizing only the denuclearization, I think we didn't have an opportunity to focusing on the other so looks like a soft but very important issue, that is human rights. Therefore, I think it was 2014 that when my predecessor Lee Jong-un became ambassador on human rights. It wasn't about North Korea alone, but according to him, he's more than 90%, if not 95% of his work is something related to the North Korean human rights issue. I think North Korean human rights issue is that serious, and then the other thing was comfort women issue and all everything else. So that in recognition of that importance, there are kind of a high awareness of importance of appointing them special somebody who can specifically working on the North Korean human rights issue. But that somehow coincide with the 2016 passage of North Korean Human Rights Act. As a matter of fact, encouraged by the the U.S., the North Korean Human Rights Act in 2004, and which is leading the You Become Ambassador, right? 2005, the North Korean Assembly started to discuss about we, South Korea, need the North Korean Human Rights Act. But it took 11 years because of the opposition parties' reluctance and objection. It took 11 years to finally, both ruling and opposition party agreed to make a North Korean Human Rights Act. The two important, the content is appointment of the ambassador like me, and then another thing is establishment of the North Korean Human Rights Foundation. That is the bipartisan or multi-partisan the foundation, just like NED, kind of the Korean NED style. But unfortunately, because of the, again, opposition party's objection, who turned out to be the ruling party later on, we were not able to establish the Human Rights Foundation even now. So therefore, somebody like me's position is not only just talking about North Korean human rights alone, but that can be somehow like dealt with a bit broader perspectives, including the North Korean security issue, as well as the what South Korea can reduce the very divisive opinion over what we should do for North Korean the problems, including the North Korean human rights issue.
Thank you. The second question I had for you is, I noticed that your title is Ambassador for International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights. So I wonder if you could speak to that. I know we were talking earlier and you said you've been doing this job for 2 months. You haven't traveled during COVID, but you've done enough traveling in the past 2 months for a lifetime. Can you tell us a little bit about what your goals, what your plans, what your goals are in terms of building international cooperation?
Well, to clarify, this is only my third, but within 2 weeks. And first two was I was invited to Toronto and Brussels as a professor, and then the Korean MOFA piggyback on my original plan, right? Although that ended with my major job at the time. So as a matter of fact, this trip to DC is my first, first travel as an ambassador, and I think the more will come within the next couple of months. But anyway, yes. A lot of people just call me as a North Korean human rights ambassador, and I believe that there are some discussion, if not controversy, over my appointment in the first place, because there are so many experts and also like scholarly people or who's been committed to North Korean human rights alone for a long while. Then how come she just came here? She's only working for United Nations and wrote some more than a couple of papers on North Korean refugee issue. Well, I think President Yoon and his government decided to appoint me, although I didn't work for them during their candidate period, is because you can find the President Yoon's statement to saying that he value freedom. So as you may know, in his inauguration ceremony, he mentioned the term freedom 35 times, and the last UN General Assembly speech 21 times. So he really value in the freedom. That freedom is very much to do with the human rights issue, right? So he said, unlike a previous government, he want to devote this specific issue by appointing the North Korean ambassador, which was long overdue. Korea would like to play so-called primary leading role in improving the North Korean human rights. So I think for that, while I studiously work with and listen to those who've been working for this issue as the grassroots, another important task for me is how I can try to be either platform or coordinator for international society. Like, actually, when I talk with the Bob King, it was only 2 weeks old when I was upon my appointment. I just told him I look forward to seeing appointment of the U.S. Special Envoy so that I can build up some kind of tripartite cooperation between me, Korea, and the U.S. and United Nations. But the Bob was experienced and diplomatic enough to nicely advise me. Probably I want to work with the U.S. and EU, which is like-minded countries in the first place, because although there are so many values in United Nations, since United Nations has a structural limitation, not only because North Korea is a member state, but also the increasing influence by the China, it might be hard to making a closer coordination in every time. But so somehow, as I just getting older and as an ambassador, I start to realize what you mean by that. Or after your 7 years experience, probably you just give me a very valuable advice. So that I decide to start with my network with so-called like-minded countries in the first place, although I didn't forget about how I can integrate those unlike-minded countries into this basket as well. But you know, upon my appointment, I realized I'm so popular among European community in South Korea. European ambassador and diplomat and scholarly community and those who are visiting Korea from European countries, they would like to talk with me and they would like to have things together with me to improve this human rights issue. So last week when I was just went to the Brussels in the first place, I had a high expectation to achieve a lot of things. But it only take half day that my high expectation turned out to be sort of a frustration or disappointment, because there are big temperature difference between those European people who are interested in North Korea in South Korea and those the people who are working in the Europe, because Europe is so much preoccupied with other priority and urgency, such as Ukraine crisis and what they want to do with the cold winter because of the energy crisis. So how to revitalize the European interest in promoting the North Korean human rights issue appears to be my another task. So when I had a meeting with a senior officer yesterday at White House, I told him to deliver my message to President Biden. Well, he said yes, so hopefully he can do it. You appointing the Special Envoy, it would be very important for the 3 reasons. Number 1 is it will be clear warning message to North Korean regime. Well, human rights matter when it comes to U.S. foreign policy toward North Korea. Therefore, that will be, as I said in my speech, that will be the light of hope for those North Korean ordinary people who suffer every day. Number 2, it's also good message to European community and like-minded countries, because President Biden emphasizing the value and norms of like-minded countries, right? So by appointing Special Envoy of the U.S., that will be a kind of the alarm call for the European Union to refocus on North Korean issue despite their other urgency. Third, I told him it would be beneficial for President Biden himself and his government, because the President Biden and his team is now working very hard to prepare for Summit of the Democracy. And I think that will take place soon. But what is the democracy? Development of the democracy is exactly coincide with development of the human rights. So if we can only talking about democracy, that term is very controversial. But if we can talk about universal human rights together with the democracy, I think his appeal and his endeavors to promote the democracy will having a more rational and a more fruitful outcome. That's what I try to tell him. So far, that is what I mean by international cooperation to improve the North Korean human rights issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. So I guess the question I have for Bob, and it's a serious question, is okay, there is a confirmation process and, there's a vetting process. These things can take a long time. But we do have the newly appointed ambassador for international cooperation on North Korean human rights visiting Washington for the first time. Is it inconceivable that as a message of commitment to this issue that the president would not meet with this person?
It would be very nice if the president would. During the time that I was serving as Special Envoy, I met with South Korea's president at the time and frequently met with the foreign minister and with a number of other senior officials there. One of the problems and one of the obstacles to getting this appointment through the U.S. government is the volume of other kinds of problems that are going on. What's happening in Ukraine has certainly not made it easier to appoint a human rights ambassador for North Korea. What's going on in Florida, the other kinds of issues that we're facing. On the other hand, it seems to me that at least the appointment of an ambassador would be a good message that would be helpful and that would be important in terms of this.
I'm not trying to compare or make any partisan comments, but so I worked for President Bush, and he had a real passion for this issue, as you know well. He read books written by North Korean defectors. He invited North Korean refugees into the White House, into the Oval Office. I sat in those meetings. And even since he's left the presidency, he still maintains this, Bob, you know well, because you've been involved in this, a scholarship fund for North Korean defectors who are trying to get an education in the United States. So I guess my point is that a lot of it really does start at the top, and President Obama was very committed to it. He had you for 8 years. So I guess the question I have for Shinhwa is that what is your sense of President Yoon and his commitment to this issue? And then for Bob, I know there is a lot of talk about how the Biden administration has brought human rights back to the center of U.S. foreign policy. But do you see that, as someone who has worked these issues for decades on Capitol Hill and as a presidential appointee, do you see that from the Biden administration? So first, maybe Shinhwa first.
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned, President Yoon has been emphasizing the importance of freedom and just going things together with those people who share the values and norms of the liberal democratic society, right? Having said that, as I mentioned earlier, he won the South Korea can play a leading role in dealing with the North Korean human rights issues. However, I would say, although I want to be careful about this, the way he approached North Korea is slightly different from the previous conservative regimes. What I'm saying is, usually in the Korea, when it comes to human rights issue, it was very divisive. I think it was Susan Short, you mentioned last week or something, the U.S. Is also very divided now. The American society is very divided, but still you have a blessing because both Democratic and Republican congressmen have at least on the same page when it comes to dealing with the North Korean issue. But unfortunately, in the case of the South Korea, we have a very divisive country now, from the left wing to right wing. And then even the parliamentmen and politicians having a very differing and divisive idea when it comes to how to deal with the North Korean human rights issue. So what I'm saying is, usually if a right wing came to power, it tend to only focusing on accountability and transitional justice. While left wing just came to power, they are talking about, as you mentioned earlier, humanitarian assistance and the reunion of the separated family members. But I think we really need to find the optimal point, and I think that's probably what President Yoon and his team try to do it. The reason I'm saying that is He's not only blame or try to emphasizing the importance of the accountability and importance of the human rights. He didn't forget, as shown in his declaration of audacious initiatives he was talking about in Korea's Independence Day in August 15. He also emphasizing the importance of the humanitarian assistance. So although I would say he has a principle for what usually conservative, the wing was highlighting for what North Korean human rights is about, he didn't forget about the importance of the humanitarian assistance. So that how the Yoon government can find some optimal point for that. That means that while he tried addressing the North Korean human rights violation, at the very same time, he doesn't want to burning the bridge of inter-Korean relation or inter-Korean dialogue. So it was tall order, but I think we are still developing those plans and ideas to find out the optimal solution, although it's very hard.
One of the things that I want to emphasize, I am disappointed with the Biden administration for not filling this position. On the other hand, the Biden administration has made some decisive progress in terms of re-emphasizing human rights issues. One of the things that I think was symbolically particularly important was the American decision to rejoin the participation in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. That was, the United States has participated in that. It pulled out. The United States withdrew from participation during the previous administration. One of the first actions by the administration was to engage again with the Human Rights Council. We have been elected. We're one of the 45 UN member states that sit on the council right now. We've been active and involved, and that represents a major shift in terms of where we were during the previous administration. The other thing, again, in the United Nations, is that the United States has again begun to play a much more active role on human rights in the UN Security Council. One of the most important things that we have in terms of calling attention to North Korea's human rights violations is a practice that we've had going on now since almost 2014, almost every year, not every year. We've been able to have a Security Council session devoted to discussing North Korea human rights as an issue that threatens the peace and security of the international community. The United States was leading that effort during the first few years after the Commission of Inquiry report was presented, which was the event that triggered the UN Security Council taking the issue up. There was 1 year recently when, in the previous administration, when the United States refused to support that issue on the agenda of the Security Council, and it was the U.S. vote that prevented it from being taken up. With the Biden administration, that has changed. When the issue came up last December, and it usually comes up in December in connection with the International Human Rights Day, December 10th, I think it is, we were leading the effort to have that discussion, and we had that discussion last December. I am certain that that will continue and that we will have that discussion this December as well. You know, the Biden administration hasn't appointed the special envoy. They should be criticized for not having done so, but at the same time, we have made progress in terms of moving in a more positive direction of emphasizing human rights, and I think that's particularly important. Legislation is now being considered in the House to extend the North Korea Human Rights Act. It expires, I think it's sometime this fall. Legislation has been introduced. It's been approved by committee in the Senate. There's still, I think, a good chance that it's likely to go forward when the House and Senate resume meetings in December. The one thing to keep in mind is that there are not a lot of issues on which Democrats and Republicans agree these days. One of those issues is the North Korea Human Rights Act. When the act was reauthorized in 2018, it was a unanimous vote, and there was a vote called in the House, and there was a unanimous vote in the Senate. This is an issue on which there is not partisan difference. This is an issue on which there is broad consensus. So I think it's important. The Biden administration is continuing that. There's just another step we'd like to see them take.
Great, thank you both. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk first about something that both of you referenced, and that is the role that China and Russia are playing with regard to North Korean human rights abuses. I think we had a statement from the administration, the Biden administration, recently in response to the missile testing this week. I think it was Linda Thomas Greenfield saying China and Russia are enabling North Korea. So if I could get both of your comments on the role that you think China and Russia are playing in enabling North Korean human rights abuses. So, Professor Lee. Yeah.
Let me start with one of my meeting with one Russian officer who's been working at North Korea as well as at the United Nations. Well, he kind of emphasizing importance of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. That's the kind of the main message he would like to give. And one anecdote, if I tell you, it only takes 2 days for the U.S. state government to welcome my appointment, specifying my full name, Shinhwa Lee. And it took another 2 days for Pyongyang, North Korea, to call me in Korean, 악질 대결 분자, in English, malicious confrontational villain, right? So it only take 1 or 2 weeks later when I had to talk with one of those officers in the State Department when I said that, and she said, I said, I didn't do anything, any malicious thing done, but they just call me like that, and she said, not yet. But anyway, when I talk about that to others, like including my U.S. colleagues, they said, congratulations, right? But that Russian officer, interestingly, told me, well, it's not only North Korea alone. We also start to using harsh language because the U.S. playing a very harsh policy over Russia. So I've known him for a while, but he appears to be very, very defensive of the North Korea's position. That was surprising to me, number one. Number two, he said, that was only a couple of days after the Kim Jong-un declared the North Korea as the nuclear state. And he said, that means the international community, now should take some time to sit down to consider about what we should do in facing the new international or North Korean situation, indicating we should accept North Korea as a nuclear status. I think there was a totally different position from the Russia's previous position. So I was afraid to hear that because over the Ukraine, I think Russia and U.S. is virtually at war, so that Russia is becoming more defensive and advocate for the North Korea's position. That leads to make North Korea even further emboldened for their aggression. So I think that is very worrisome, and I think the same kind of phenomenon or like a tendency can be found in the case of the China as well.
China and Russia are a real problem, in part because both of them have their own serious human rights issues. They're difficult to convince that they need to be supportive on human rights when they're doing some of the worst human rights abuses going on right now. The difficulty in terms of China and Russia is that we have to deal with China and Russia in terms of UN sanctions against North Korea for its nuclear and missile programs. The only way we're going to be able to prevent North Korea from making progress on nuclear and missile issues is to limit exports of certain products and limit sources of funds that go into those programs. And that is something we've been able to do to some extent through sanctions that have been imposed by the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council imposes those sanctions. They're mandatory on all UN member states. But in order to get the 15-member UN Security Council to agree to this, you have to have the 5 permanent members, including China and Russia, supporting whatever the action is. And this puts a very difficult twist on human rights issues. North Korea has serious human rights problems. China and Russia aren't terribly anxious to put pressure on them for their human rights issues. They're willing to go at least partway on the sanctions for security, and we are happy they're willing to go that far. And this is what really makes it difficult, because to a great extent, Russia and China are enabling North Korea to do a lot of the, to engage in a lot of the human rights violations that they are involved in. We need to continue to press North Korea. We need to continue to press China and Russia on these issues. It's not clear that it's an easy task, and it's not going to move forward quickly, but we've got to do it. We've got to try to find a way to do both human rights and sanctions on military issues.
I mean, one of the things that's striking is that, you know, we have a whole battery of UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, provisions of which are to be triggered by actions that the North Koreans take, like flying ballistic missiles over other countries, and yet those are not being enforced at all by China or Russia today, in spite of the fact they signed on to those agreements in the past. And as you said, they're not enforcing sanctions, is allowing the funds for proliferation financing. It's very clear, as well as slave labor. It's very clear that that's been documented by a lot of the work done by NGOs out there. So we're at the point now where we should open it to questions, although I do have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you all, but I think we should open up to the floor for questions, and then I also have a bunch of questions that I received online. So, but I first will go to the folks in the room to see if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. And while you're thinking of questions, let me go to one of the questions that came in online. And so the question is, do South Korean young professionals and the next generation of South Korean leadership believe that its nation should take advantage of its newfound global popularity to be a more vocal and visible defender of values like human rights, democracy, rule of law, civil rights and freedom, and open market economy? So I guess that question is to you, Ambassador Lee, for younger generation. Or what is your sense of how, I mean, you're a professor, you have lots of students. What is your sense of their commitment to these issues, and I guess the degree to which they see the liberal international order, you know, literally under attack these days? So.
Well, I think younger generation is more keen on the problem of justice within the South Korea, while North Korea human rights is just just a neighboring issue. It doesn't seem to be just our issue or my issue. So I think it is very important to tell them, as Ambassador Oh Jun previously mentioned, North Koreans are not anybody to the South Korea that was very touched by the younger generation. So I think we need some kind of momentum to educate and also kind of encourage them to think about why North Korean human rights issue is very important, not only from the universal humanity perspectives, but also as the person who are not anybody to us. So, but still, it's very hard for the young generations in South Korea to get a job they want. So that I think they feel a lot of frustration, and they always have some kind of even furious about why they have to come up with this kind of situation, all after studying and working very hard. So how to balance between their own position as somebody who subjects to injustice versus how we can address injustice problem in North Korea, which is North Korean human rights abuse, has to be well explained. And I think that is a kind of the homework and the duty of we established generation, including myself, to tell the people. Because once I became this ambassador, several students of mine told me, wow, you're going to working about the North Korean human rights issue, then I think I will start to reading about what is going on there. So at least I influenced 10 of my students to start to refocus on North Korean human rights issue, and hopefully they can be spread out around the world.
That's great. It's interesting because, I mean, and I know, Bob, you did this as Special Envoy, and you still do this. You've spoken on many campuses here in the United States where among the student community, there seems to be a lot of interest in this issue.
Yeah, students are interested in this. One of the things that's helped is the interest in South Korean culture, and that is something that has a growing following here in the United States, and I think that's been encouraging. But I've found that when I've spoken at campuses, and I've done, as you say, on a number of occasions, there is a lot of interest in what's going on. Part of it is, or part of the reason for it is, North Korea is an interesting place. Not a lot of people have been there. It's one of these interesting enigmas, and when you start talking about what some of the problems are, there is interest in what's happening, and that's something that gets the attention of younger people.
Yeah, I mean, you see it on campus. I mean, at Stanford, at Georgetown, all of these student organizations, different student organizations on North Korean human rights, and they're quite dedicated and serious about the work that they do. Okay, I have another question here that came in online for Ambassador Lee. Let's see, South Korean human rights groups, civil society organizations, and the defector activist community have been at the forefront of advocating for North Korean human rights, providing critical documentation on this crisis and working to advance democracy. How do you plan to engage with this community to advance North Korean human rights from your position as Special Envoy?
Well, as I mentioned, for my first 6 weeks plus, I think I spent, I wouldn't say enough time, but I did my best to meet with as many possible civil organizations and people who are working for North Korean human rights issues. And it was very informative, and also it was very touching in many ways. That's why I said in my speech, I would like to pay my respect and honor to them, those who are working on that issue for a long time, despite all those difficulties they face. But at the very same time, I faced some difficulty in how to coordinating all those diverse and sometimes confrontational views and approaches they try to explain to me to take it. Most of them are focusing on accountability and transitional justice, I think, which is very important. And as you may not know very well, some Korean NGOs have been a very important and instrumental role to persuade in European Commission to push forward, which can end up with the COI report. right? But on the other hand, there are NGOs and also people who are working for North Korean human rights issue, including young generations, focusing on humanitarian assistance. Because they said if we can talking about accountability and etc., then we will cut off our relation with the North Korean regime, so that we cannot just give any kind of benefit to the North Korean people to feed. So that's the one point. And another thing, while I was working with, I wouldn't say working with, when I listened to them, one very important thing is while basic right to feed them is very important, I think basic right to let them know what is going on in the world is very, very important. That's why maybe dissemination of the information is as critical as to giving them food and other assistance. Why? Because human beings obviously need dignity as well as their own survival itself, right? So I think several NGOs, particularly who are formed by the North Korean defectors, they are very much interested in sending the message or sending the information and some goods to North Korea through leaflet or balloons or other means. And as you know, the previous government banned on the sending the leaflet, and there are a lot of discussion, and I got many questions what I should do if I can do something. But still, as I mentioned in our private discussion, I want to be very careful about the method, because there are so many important North Korean human rights issues we need to deal with. But when I just got appointed, all North Korean human rights issue was overshadowed by that fishery officer, the unfortunate killing of fishery, the officers of the Korean government, right, killed by the North Korean, and also the forced repatriation of those North Korean two young men. And that is the only thing they've been focusing on. But I'm afraid if I can bring up the issue for the lifting the ban on that law, will invite another very big political controversy among the South Korean parliament men, so that can overshadow all other important issues that I think we have to pursue. And as you know, even if I or other government officer try to lift the ban now, we need a parliamentary approval. But unfortunately, for now, the opposition leader who's in favor of the ban formed a majority in Korean parliament. So I think it will be a waste of time to only focusing on that issue. Therefore, while in principle, I agree with lifting the ban is important, we have to come up with together to think about the various and creative methods for how we can guarantee North Korean people get enough information to know about the world, as well as to compare what happens to them with what other people's situation, so that the North Korean regime can be aware of their people's thinking and the voice.
This next question is for both of you, and I know you've already addressed some of this in your prior responses, but the question is, what are the most pressing issues that you believe should be addressed at the national and the international levels in the next couple of years? So what, like if you had your list of things that you would want to move forward on the North Korean human rights agenda, what would they be? And this question is to both of you.
It's a tough question. The difficulty is, how do you get the attention of the North Koreans on these issues? You know, The problems in North Korea include a lack of food, a lack of access to medical care, also includes lack of access to information, lack of the basic human rights that people in most parts, or many parts of the world enjoy. It's not easy. My feeling is that one of the most important things is to focus attention on getting information into North Korea. Because one of the effects of information is that when people in North Korea know what's going on elsewhere, it puts pressure on the North Korean government from inside to make progress and to make improvements. And so my sense is we need to do that. We need to focus on how we get information into North Korea. It's difficult because North Korea has control over radios. You can't buy radios that have certain kinds of capabilities. It is increasingly difficult to smuggle thumb drives, to be able to bring in information to be watched on videos. And the tightness of the border, which COVID has introduced, has made it even more difficult than it was in the past to do this. We need to find ways of getting information into North Korea so that North Koreans have some idea of what is going on in the outside world and what the outside world thinks of North Korea. So my sense is that's one of the areas that we definitely need to focus on. We need to find ways of making progress in terms of doing that. But working with North Korea, trying to make progress on human rights is not easy. It requires a lot of creativity and a lot of effort.
Well, three things. Number one, maybe in a short run, I would like to call for the North Korean regime to accept the international organizations and the foreign embassy ambassadors to come back. I think that is very important, the entry point to improve the North Korean human rights issue. At the very same time, I would like to have actually, I've been meeting a lot of people and a lot of organizations, but I didn't and I even meet with the U.S. congressman, and I will meet with the CRS people tomorrow as well. But unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to meet with the Korean parliament man yet. I could have met the ruling party members, but I didn't do it because if I only meet with the ruling party members, I think there is no point. So hopefully within a couple of weeks, I would like to meet with both ruling and opposition, the parliament men, to discuss about the human rights issues. The second is I would like to depend on the Professor Shin Gi-yuk and Victor Cha and other the eminent scholarly groups to organizing some kind of a governmental, non-governmental, and scholarly forum for the making some international consensus over what we mean by the North Korean human rights issues. But last but not least, it will be 10 years by the end of next year. It will be 10 years to celebrating the release of the COI report. And I think this is the very time to go back to what we did in COI report and what we've been achieved and what we've been missing. So I think that the revisiting the COI report, not necessarily writing again, but still it's very important to update and also elaborating the point so that we just deliver some warning message to North Korean the regime.
Thank you. That's a very good list. That's a lot of homework.
By the way, Victor, can I just tell you one thing? When I said the North Korean regime, that Russian officer whom I met in Korea said, Ambassador Lee, you should remember we didn't say North Korean regime. We have to say North Korean government. I listen to them, but I still say North Korean regime.
Well, that point is interesting because, as Bob noted earlier, the North Korean human rights issue is one of the few issues where there's bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. Whereas, I mean, as we know well, in South Korea, it has become politicized in a way that's quite unfortunate, because I don't think anybody in their personal capacity in Korea would disagree that human rights are being horribly abused in North Korea.
By implementing North Korean Human Rights Act, we have one more homework to finish. That is the establishment of a North Korean Human Rights Foundation. There are a lot of political controversy over that, and the opposition party tried to say we should change the name to from North Korean Human Rights Foundations to Korean Peninsula Peace Foundation. But I do believe it's not a question of whether we change the name or we establish the foundation. It is not a question of that, but it is question of implementing Human Rights Act.
Right.
That is the law, which has been the long due already.
Yeah. What about if it's not a North Korean Human Rights Foundation, or it's not a Korean Peninsula Peace Foundation, because that also becomes a politically loaded term. You said that President Yoon mentioned freedom and democracy, 20 times in his inauguration speech and at the UN General Assembly. I mean, what about something like?
I'm afraid that will dilute what we are supposed to do. I think we have a very specific mandate to address the North Korean human rights abuse.
Right.
I think we have to focus that. I think one of the critics what the previous UN Special Rapporteur Quintana got from the Korean NGOs is he tried to dilute his mandate by saying not only North Korean human rights abuse, but also some kind of the South Korea's human rights problem, including like the homosexual, the rights, and etc. Actually, one of the very reason for him to do that is in the very beginning, he was tempting to visit North Korea. But I want to tell the new Special Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon, together with me, she will be the last two person to visit North Korea in our lifetime. So I think that is the kind of our gut. That should be our commitment in order to make us at least a small advancement on North Korean human rights improvement.
But what about the creation of a foundation for freedom and democracy?
We talk about North Korean Human Rights Foundation, right?
Yeah.
But as you may know, the Korean liberal government tried to emphasizing everything is a denuclearization of North Korea versus denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
That diluted the essence of the problem, essence of the question. I think that's the way they can somehow try to have some negotiation and some kind of the dialogue with the North Korea. But by now they better learn the lesson, because no matter how hard we try to engage with the North Korea, no matter how hard we try to give something to North Korea, I think they only take advantage over our attitude. As you may read the newspaper, the Kim Jong-un, 2 to 3 days after he met with the President Moon Jae-in and have a very nice talk, he wrote a letter to the Trump say we better meet alone. So they always try to belittle or disregard the presence of the South Korea. So I think if we try to giving ear to them in order to improve the inter-Korean relations, I think that will make a situation always worse. Because like, for instance, European Union told me that the North Korean delegate came to European Union to saying, if you withdraw the UN resolution, then we will think about resume political dialogue or even human rights dialogue. So if you are harsh on something that you cannot adhere to with a principled approach, then the counterpart will start to negotiate. But if we try to step back in order to attract them, I think that only embolden their aggressive behavior. I think that was the biggest mistake what President Moon Jae-in government did.
Thank you. There's a question, but I wanted to ask Bob before we go. I mean, so you did this job for 7, almost 8 years. Ambassador Lee is now, 2 weeks into the job, or 2 months into the job?
2 months, 1 week.
2 months and 1 week, but it feels like 2 years and 1 month. what advice would you give her based on your experience working this issue? I mean, not just for 7 years, but also for decades in the U.S. Congress. What advice would you offer Ambassador Lee?
Well, I have a book that may be helpful. This actually is a book that I wrote. This is thanks to Jiwook Shin's generosity at Stanford. I was able to sit down and put together my experience topic by topic over time, and sort of try to look at what I was trying to do, what the U.S. was trying to do, and where we did the right things and where we did the wrong things. Let me give you this as lots of, it's not directly applicable to what you're doing, but it may give you some idea of what we tried to do and some of the problems that we encountered and some of the successes that we had. Dealing with the North Korea human rights issue is not an easy thing, and it requires a certain ability to say, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to continue to do it in spite of the fact that I get slapped down many times. It's the kind of thing that you need to continue to do it. One of the things that I found very helpful, when I was the Special Envoy, when I was in Seoul, and I made multiple trips to Seoul every year, I was able to meet with some of the defectors who left North Korea, who were being given some experience of how to deal with life in South Korea at Hanwon. And the South Korean government, the Ministry of Unification, was extremely generous in allowing me to meet with some of these people who had recently arrived from the North. And talking with these people and discussing with them what life in the North was like, the difficulty of getting out of North Korea, was something that always invigorated me and made me want to try harder to look at things. It's harder to do that nowadays because the number of defectors leaving North Korea has significantly declined. But when you talk to North Koreans, it can't help but inspire you to do what you can to help them. And I found that that was one of the most important things that I could do. I hope you find some advice.
In addition, you told me in a private setting, the being present in international conference and meeting is very important. That also I appreciate your advice. Thank you so much. Oh, great, great. Actually, the Professor Shin and your book on how to balance or how to make a connection between the North Korean military aggression, security, and the human rights issue are the kind of my very primary concern as well.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Thank you, really, Ambassador Lee, Ambassador King, for a wonderful session. Let's give them a round of applause. This concludes our conference. For those of you in the room and those of you watching online, Gyuk, you want to give me the book so I can show it on screen to folks? Okay. So for those of you online who are watching, this is the book that came out of the conference that we did at Stanford and online. With regard to North Korean human rights, and it's got some great chapters covering all sorts of issues. And then, of course, Bob King's book on patterns of impunity, also recommended reading for those of you interested in human rights. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Stanford, APARC, and Professor Shin for co-hosting this conference with us here at CSIS. And for those of you online, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for sending in your questions. We are now adjourned. Thank you.